Okay. Hello, everybody. Good work on week three. I decided I would, as before, give some reflections and clarifications based on my reading of your comments and my sense of the sorts of points that seemed to register and perhaps some points that were more difficult or challenging. So here we go. Um, One preliminary point that I want to make has to do with the very notion of ethnography. So this week is about ethnography as a form of bioethical inquiry. If we want to make any kind of bioethical argument about the permissibility or impermissibility of some practice that perhaps intersects with medical care, then it's important, obviously, to try to understand the practice in its own terms as best as we can. Now, one way that ethnography tends to work in reality is that researchers from one cultural context, and predominantly that will be researchers from the global north, will engage in ethnography studies by going to some far flung location to uh, perform an ethnographic study on some other culture. And often this has a risk of an orientalizing or othering type of approach where the very interest in the practice stems from the sense that there's something exotic and different happening. One major emphasis of this course is that it's important to turn our critical bioethical lens, whether we're doing ethnographic research for bioethics or whether we're doing survey based research for bioethics or any of the different methodologies that we'll be exploring, that these methodologies need to be turned in on culturally familiar practices and on institutions that are in the backdrop of our own work, potentially. And so, this self reflexiveness, this ability to be critical about things that are taken for granted within a dominant cultural space, such as Western culture, American culture, and that includes, of course, Western medical research and scientific research. These are cultures, these are institutions. Science is itself something that's done by uh, situated people who have their own histories, their own beliefs, their own biases, their own assumptions, and so forth. And so, one of the reasons that we'll be focusing on practices that are considered common and acceptable within contemporary American culture is to try to move away from this, as I said before, this orientalizing tendency to want to voyeuristically primarily examine the practices of quote unquote other cultures. Now, some of what we're discussing is practices that are more common within, say, African immigrant populations or some Muslim communities, as in the case of the Dawoodi Bohra, when we're talking about female circumcision or genital cutting. And the reason why we need to raise this case is because it's often used as a contrast, as a way of basically drawing attention away from dominant practices within American culture. So, for example, sometimes people will raise a critique about intersex genital modifications or male circumcision, as we'll talk about. And in response, somebody might say, "Oh, well, that's nothing like these barbaric practices that happen in uh, Africa, in some sort of sense that Africa is this homogenous continent where awful things happen." Well, given that that's a common rhetorical move within these sorts of discussions, there's a need to, take a close look at those practices and realize how what it is that we think we know about them is shaped by some of um, these seeming motivations to want to draw a clear line between what other groups do and what we do, and this need to defend a sort of the received normalcy of one's own cultural perspective. So as a part of that, I noticed that a couple of you, when you're drawing distinctions between, female genital cutting and male genital cutting, some of you seem to sort of fall back on or rely on certain ideas about what you think FGM is all about. So one of you mentioned, well, it's primarily about controlling female sexuality, whereas male circumcision isn't about controlling sexuality. So, these are complex historical and anthropological matters. I'm going to share perhaps one or two articles that you can read as supplementary readings to dig into those issues a little bit more. There are also some questions about, what we really know about the implications for health complications or effects on sexual sensation. These are scientifically very difficult questions. We may be able to get into some of them. How would you measure these things scientifically, and how would you conduct a study to come up with good evidence to adjudicate these claims? But before getting into the nitty gritty, I just want us to constantly be thinking about why is it that I think certain things about these practices that I don't have, primary expertise in? Where am I getting my information from? What is the source or the origins of this discourse? And how would I actually go about checking to find out whether what common knowledge is on a given topic is in fact well supported by primary evidence and is, the best supported view among people who have expertise in that area? Okay, so that's a lot of background about why we're doing ethnography and why we're turning our ethnographic lens on Western medicine, Western institutions, rather than the typical way of doing things, which is to peer at other cultures. Um, Lauren made a point about how we define health. So in a previous lecture, I said, look, the obligation of a doctor is to the health of a child. The doctor isn't meant to play the role of a cultural broker. Lauren very aptly pointed out that the line between those two concepts may not be altogether very stark. So, what we count as health is itself a culturally informed concept. Just as an example, the World Health Organization has a definition of health that it uses, which says it's not just the absence of disease, but rather is complete psychosocial well being, including physical well being as well. Now, this definition has been criticized by many people for being overly broad, the idea being that this seems to give medicine permission to help itself to all aspects of our lives and well being. Whereas perhaps it would be better to have a professional division of labor where medical doctors should be dealing with physical health or things that fall within the measurable biological sciences and develop expertise around those issues. Whereas issues with culture and society and sociology and so forth, those are really, you know, things for other institutions to potentially tackle. Whereas if we just decide that all of life is potentially a matter of health or disease, then we're going to tend to medicalize all of life. All of life is going to be seen in terms of medicalized categories rather than, in terms of the logic of other types of institutions. So you're absolutely right. As a practical matter, how it is that we define what's healthy or unhealthy is not a freestanding concept that can just be objectively evaluated from any perspective. Those very distinctions tend to be up for debate, and the boundaries between these things can be somewhat porous. Um, so, what else did I want to talk about? Issue of consent. Okay, so several of you said, well, look, there's different debates about the empirical dimensions of these contested cultural practices. But one very important difference, of course, is that some of these tend to be consensual and some of them tend not to be consensual. And I just want to clarify a few things about this. One is that the World Health Organization definition of FGM doesn't mention anything about consent. It just talks about medical necessity, or as it says, for medical reasons, which are which can be interpreted broadly or narrowly depending on your aims. So I happen to agree that consent is sort of the critical ethical distinction between the practices we should tend to tolerate or um, uh, possibly think are acceptable for doctors to perform, and the ones that we should be more skeptical of. But in reality, the World Health Organization can't use consent as the line drawing exercise because that would exclude neonatal male circumcision, which is a common Western practice, which the WHO has no interest in critiquing. So if it starts to talk about consent, it will suddenly be very obvious that it has a problem here because there are many non-consensual practices that are similarly medically non-required, including some of the intersex practices that we'll start focusing on this week. So, the WHO tries to avoid the issue of consent and just talk about non-medical reasons. It doesn't even mention whether a practice has to be uh, past some threshold of harmfulness. It just talks about the medical reasons for this. So this goes back to Lauren's point about how do we know whether something's being done for a medical reason versus a cultural reason? And what exactly is the distinction there? Isn't medicine itself part of culture? The way that doctors' roles are conceived of in different cultures is also somewhat contingent. And so these issues kind of feed back into each other. Um, right. Okay. Well, I think those might be the main clarifications I wanted to make. One last issue here. Okay. So some of you mentioned that some practices are more closely associated with problematic social norms like patriarchal expectations that position men over women, for example. And there's 2 points to make about this. One is that just empirically, this is a contentious point because virtually all societies on Earth could be characterized as patriarchal according to some definitions of patriarchy. So the mere fact that a practice happens within a patriarchal context doesn't count as evidence that the practice itself is a manifestation of patriarchy. And so, with some of my colleagues, we tried to empirically investigate this. We said, well, what are the most asymmetrical gender norms that you find in places like Afghanistan, for example, where there's a very high asymmetry between men's power and privilege and women being unable to exercise their agency. Saudi Arabia is another example where you have a very high asymmetry between men and women and their power agency in society. And what you find is that in those contexts, female genital cutting is not practiced at all. But what you do see is very high levels of male circumcision. So if you think of the practice as being something that's seen as a positive within the culture, I mean, if the culture thought it was doing something harmful or negative, then you might expect that in highly patriarchal contexts, it would be trying to impose this negative thing on girls to, as it were, keep them down. But genital modifications are, from the perspective of the culture, so here we're taking our ethnographic lens, typically seen as things that improve the child in some way, that enhance them psychosocially, spiritually, religiously, or whatever. And they often serve some social functions. For example, in the case where it's done as a rite of passage, it tends to lead to bonding among the age cohort because they're going through a very difficult experience together. And so they may, sort of attach to each other in this way. So in some cases, it's the exclusion of girls from a similar ritual that is most likely reflective of the highly asymmetrical gender norms in those contexts. Whereas every culture that practices female genital cutting also practices male genital cutting. And so you often find that there's a relative equality between boys and girls in terms of their expectation that they should undertake a challenging rite of passage into adulthood. So just to summarize, the empirical relationship between asymmetric gender norms in terms of power and control in a society and the prevalence of male or female genital alterations doesn't support this broad brushed patriarchy hypothesis. In some contexts, female genital cutting is used explicitly as a means to try to limit premarital sexual activity in cultures where that's an important norm. But that norm doesn't describe every culture that practices female genital cutting. There's a great diversity of norms around sexuality in these different cultures. So, not to put too fine a point on it, but it's important when we're looking at the evidence for different claims, and this is going to be a take home of the course, is that we have to ask about the scope to which that evidence applies. So, if we find that there's an association within one cultural framework between a certain social norm and the prevalence of a given practice, we have to ask whether that also applies to all these other contexts as well, so that we can make a generalized claim about what we think the purpose of a practice is. But in reality, you find that claims often have to be kept more circumscribed around, a set of limits as to how well we can interpret their broader implications. So those are the main things I wanted to just nudge you on in terms of some of the comments that were raised. And otherwise, I'll leave you to the planned lectures and look forward to your comments for next week.